It's not unheard of us to list pharaohs who wouldn't appear in any ancient Egyptian king lists. Most famously, Akhenaten and those who followed him in the 18th dynasty were deliberately struck from the record. But today, I'm talking about a pharaoh who doesn't usually make it even to modern lists. The pharaoh I'm not talking about, but that I'm going to talk about for a little bit just to mix things up, is Ptolemy Philopator, or as we might call him these days, Ptolemy IV. And if A Game of Thrones and its sequels hadn't been inspired by the English Wars of the Roses, they could have been inspired by Ptolemy IV's reign. Under the influence of sinister advisors, a sort of courtier the Ptolemies were very fond of recruiting, Ptolemy, 20 years old when he acceded to the double crown, began his rule with a dramatic purge of several of his family members, and they were killed in some very Game of Thrones ways. Poisonings, stabbings, one was even boiled to death in his own bath. But Ptolemy IV would have a lot more blood on his hands by the time he was done. The Ptolemies had long divided Egypt along ethnic lines, with the Hellenic stratum enjoying generally higher status than the indigenous Egyptians. As a consequence of this, and likely the ruinous taxation imposed upon Egyptians to fund a military campaign in Syria, many Egyptians decided they'd had enough. So the last years of Ptolemy's reign were marked by rebellion by his own citizens. Not only did large portions of Lower Egypt rebel against Alexandrian rule, but a separate and much more successful rebellion was launched from the south, centred on the ancient royal city of Thebes. This brings us to the pharaoh I am talking about, who I haven't talked about, Horwen-Nefer. Obviously the fact that he isn't always listed as a pharaoh means it's controversial of me to call him one, but his rebellion wasn't a short-lived scuffle like others against Ptolemy IV. Horwen-Nefer led a full-on secession, and it worked. Horwen-Nefer and his forces seized Thebes and thus destabilised Ptolemaic rule of Upper Egypt. This was a mixed success, because it did open Egypt up to trouble from the south, but Horwen-Nefer had himself crowned pharaoh and proceeded to rule for 20 years, give or take. He even outlived Ptolemy IV, and part of the reason he was able to rule for so long was that the child king Ptolemy V was beset by regencies and rebellions that were a far more immediate threat than a pretender far to the south. At some point, Horwen-Nefer either changed his name to or was succeeded by Ankh-Wen-Nefer, but by this point the writing was on the wall, because Ptolemy V's forces were descending upon the south. After a few sieges, Ankh-Wen-Nefer was captured. Like everything about the life and reign of Horwen-Nefer and Ankh-Wen-Nefer, we're not sure exactly what happened. He might have been spared, but a good many rebel leaders were executed as part of Ptolemy V's extended coronation ceremony, and Ankh-Wen-Nefer may very well have been among them. Horwen-Nefer didn't succeed in establishing a new indigenous dynasty, but in some ways his defiance of the Ptolemies was effective. The long campaign to get Egypt back under Alexandrian rule was one of attrition, and Ptolemy V's regime does seem to have been forced to make compromises on how the Egyptians were ruled and taxed. And several of these reforms are famously recorded upon what is now the Rosetta Stone. The tolerance of the Egyptian people had been stretched to breaking point, and they'd made it clear that no pharaoh would be put up with if they took so many iniquitous liberties. The reason we don't know much about Horwen-Nefer and Ankh-Wen-Nefer is that, like Akhenaten 1,000 years beforehand, any official record of their reigns was expunged. Even so, Horwen-Nefer reigned for 2 decades, and ruled one of the 2 kingdoms. So the only thing that makes him a pretender and Ptolemies 4 and 5 legitimate is that, of course, they won in the end. The victory for them was bittersweet, however, as well as having to compromise on the rights of their Egyptian subjects. Quelling so much internal unrest shrank the Ptolemaic kingdom and forever diminished its importance on the world stage. From a certain point of view, Egypt's eventual fate to become the vassal of a larger empire was sealed by these 2 kings and their response to crisis. But that was always the dilemma that had afflicted pharaohs going back to the Old Kingdom. Egypt's place in the world meant that the balance between domestic and foreign affairs was always incredibly delicate. Despite, perhaps because of, being a gateway between 3 continents, it was difficult for an Egyptian ruler to both look outward and inward with perfect clarity, particularly if you were a foreign ruler and couldn't rely on the loyalty enjoyed by the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom. So, was Horwen-Nefer a pharaoh? Is it wrong that he's not usually listed as anything more than a pretender? I think so. He could have been, for all we know, a very effective ruler, or a highly incompetent one. But thanks to his erasure from history, we may never know more about him than we do right now. If you look up Horwen-Nefer online, you'll struggle to find more than a few paragraphs, and none of them very detailed. Given that this was a king who reigned for 20 years, I think that's more than a little sad. Thanks for stopping by, and a huge welcome to my new subscribers. I just hit 1,000 a few days ago, which is a big compliment and I'm very grateful. I hope you stick around and find more to enjoy. In particular, you might like my recent essay-length video about museums and the authority they hold over our cultures. The sinister agents conspiring to bend history in my favour are my backers at patreon.com/armchairegypt. Huge thanks to you as always. Until next time, my fellow armchair Egyptologists, life, prosperity, and health to you all. Thanks for watching. Head over to my channel for more, or click here to see what the YouTube demons think you should watch next. I hope you'll consider subscribing. If you'd like to support and collaborate on the channel with me, go to patreon.com/armchairegypt. You can also join my Discord community, there's an invite link in the description.